Anyway, so today we're talking about a story of a man by the name of Donald Larson. This happened a long time ago, but it's worth looking into. And I think that we can find some lessons if we look pretty closely at it, okay? So, the title here is Kindness to Carnage, the story of Donald Larson. Let's go ahead and get into it. Before the headlines called him a monster, Donald Larson was a suspect in a crime he may never have committed. 4 years later, he became bigger than the monster that they had named. This is the story of how a kidnapping turned into a massacre and how truth got lost in the noise. As always, we're not here to glorify violence or chase shock. We're here to stand in the center, the place between judgment and understanding, and ask what happens when a man's world and life story collapse under the weight of perception. July 27, 1972, in Orano, Minnesota, Virginia Piper was at home. Quiet morning in a very affluent neighborhood, and she felt safe. Maybe a little too safe. Two men walked up the drive, calm and focused. They moved like they'd done this before. Within minutes, she was gone, blindfolded, handcuffed, and driven north towards Duluth. The kidnappers demanded $1 million, the largest ransom in U.S. history at the time. Her husband, Harry Piper, followed their instructions exactly. They would ask him for $1 million in a duffel bag to be put in the trunk of a car and be parked behind a bar. So he parked the car behind a bar in Wayzata, left the money inside, and walked away. Inside the bar, he made the phone call that the kidnappers had ordered, the signal that the drop was complete. When he returned to the car, he realized that the money was gone. $1 million in $20 bills. Roughly $7.9 million today had vanished without a sound and without a trace. And Harry Piper, well, he was no closer to finding his wife. 2 days later, Virginia Piper was discovered chained to a tree in Jay Cooke State Park. She was cold and she was dehydrated, but she was alive. The rescue was weird. It had begun with two different phone calls. Two ordinary citizens were contacted with directions to where she could be found. One of them a local clergyman with no ties to the Piper family. He didn't go himself. He called the authorities, repeated the instructions exactly as he'd heard them. Agents followed those directions into the woods and found her, blindfolded, exhausted, but basically unharmed. The ransom money was never recovered. The kidnappers disappeared into the folds of Minnesota's forests and highways. And the story that began in quiet Orano neighborhood had now stretched across the entire state, leaving behind a trail of questions that may never be answered. The Piper case didn't end with Virginia's rescue. It could have. Could have ended with her being rescued and safe and the $1 million just forever being lost. But it didn't. It only changed shape. You see, the Bureau had the victim, but not the kidnappers. They had the ransom serial numbers, but not the money. And when a case this large goes unsolved, it starts to spread through rumor, through speculation, and through fear. Something that you should know and realize is that the Bureau had just totally botched a high-profile case right before this. So it was real important to them that they got this win. So, when a case this large gets unsolved, it starts to spread through rumor, through speculation, through fear. Donald Larson was living in southern Minneapolis then. He was a truck driver, a husband, and a father. He wasn't part of the Piper world. He didn't have the wealth, not the lakefront property, but the story was everywhere. Every newspaper headline, every radio broadcast, and somewhere between those headlines, his name surfaced. Not officially, not in print, but just in whispers. A friend of a friend, a rumor passed through a bar. The Bureau was casting a wide net, hundreds of interviews, thousands of leads. Larson's name came up through proximity, not necessarily through evidence. But once the FBI knocks on your door, you tend not to forget it. They questioned him. They asked about his movements, his truck routes, his finances. He answered everything. He had said that he had nothing to hide, and then they left. But the silence that followed was worse than the questions. He started noticing cars parked too long outside his house. He told his wife, Ruth, that they were watching him. She told him he was imagining it. But imagination has a way of sometimes turning into reality when you're alone with it long enough. Larson began to see patterns. Headlights that flickered twice, phone clicks before the dial tone. He started drinking more, which never helps with paranoia. The city that once felt familiar now felt like a maze. Every alley looked like an escape route. Every stranger looked like an agent. And Piper had become his shadow. And the Bureau, whether they meant to or not, had built the walls of his paranoia, and they were getting taller and taller. There's a line between investigation and obsession. The Bureau was chasing $1 million in a perfect crime in repair of their reputation, if we're being honest. Larson just wanted his peace of mind back. Neither would find what they were looking for. By 1973, Larson was restless. He wanted out of the city, out of the noise, out of the invisible spotlight he felt burning through his walls. He told Ruth they needed a fresh start, and she agreed. They sold the house and bought a small farm in Willow River, a patch of land surrounded by pine and silence. It was supposed to be a reset, but you can't outrun a story once it's attached itself to your name. The Piper case was still unsolved. The ransom money was still missing, and the Bureau was still watching. In Willow River, Larson found peace for a while. But peace built on fear doesn't last. The FBI's investigation was winding down. The statute of limitations was approaching. 5 years from the day of the kidnapping. They only had 26 days left. For the Bureau, it was a countdown. For Larson, it was more like a fuse. He didn't know it yet, but the pressure of those final weeks could be what pushed him past the edge of reason. And when he broke, it wouldn't just be one life lost, it would be an entire family. April 24th, 1976. 10 days before the Bureau filed charges in the Piper case, Larson snapped. He killed 5 people. His wife Ruth, his son Mark, his neighbor James Falch Sr., Falch's son James Jr., and Larson's stepson Scott Powell. The killings were brutal, but they weren't calculated. They weren't planned. They weren't strategic. They were more like the collapse of a man who had been living inside a story he couldn't escape. The Piper case had become his reality. Every shadow, every silence, every unanswered question. And when the Bureau finally charged him, 10 days after this murder happened, it was too late. The man they were chasing no longer existed. The pressure had been building for months. The silence, the isolation, the sense that every shadow was a badge. Larson's world had narrowed to the farmhouse and the people inside it. Ruth, Mark, Scott, the Falches next door. But things were not okay inside that farmhouse. Ruth Larson had been having an affair with their neighbor and Donald's closest friend, James. She wanted a divorce. She told him she wanted his tools, the ones he used to build their life, so her new man could use them to build theirs. That morning, Falk came to the farmhouse with a trailer to collect Ruth's things. Larson returned to the farmhouse mid-move. And of course they argued. The argument didn't happen in a yard or on a neighbor's property. It happened inside Larson's own farmhouse, the place that was supposed to be his refuge. The house was filled with tension. Boxes that were half packed, voices raised, the sound of metal scraping against wood as things were being moved. Words turned into shouting. Shouting turned into a fight, and then he snapped. Larson grabbed 2 of his guns, and a massacre ensued. When police arrived, 4 people were dead. Ruth, his son Mark, his stepson Scott Powell, and Falch's 12-year-old son James Jr. Falch Sr. was still alive when the officer entered the house. He would die shortly thereafter. Larson had long since fled the scene. He drove south, checked into a hotel, and tried to end his life with vodka and pills. Before he arrived at the hotel, he threw his coat and guns he'd used into the river. He survived his attempt to end his own life. 10 days later, the Bureau charged him with the Virginia Piper kidnapping, just before the statute of limitations expired. The timing was impossible to ignore. The Bureau had been chasing a perfect crime, and Larson had been living in a perfect collapse. The Piper case probably didn't make him violent, but it perhaps built the pressure that made the violence possible. The investigation, the betrayal, the isolation, all of it converged in on that farmhouse, in that fight, in that moment when a man's world finally came apart. The Bureau had been chasing a perfect crime. Larson had been living a perfect nightmare. 10 days after the murder, like I said, the Bureau filed the charges. The statute of limitations was about to expire 5 years from the day that Virginia Piper was taken. For the Bureau, it was a countdown, and for Larson, it was the aftermath. He was jailed for the massacre of his family and neighbors when agents arrived and read the charges: kidnapping, conspiracy, extortion. The timing felt surgical. The man who had just ruined his whole life in a moment of rage was now being accused of a crime that had haunted the community for years. The trial that followed was national news. Larson and an accomplice named Kenneth Callahan were convicted in 1977. 2 years later, both of their convictions were overturned. The ransom money was never found, and the Piper case remains unsolved. In the end, the story isn't about a perfect crime or a perfect collapse. It's about pressure, the kind that builds quietly until it changes everything around it. The Bureau's out there chasing it's a mystery. This man is out here chasing peace. The family is caught between both. The Piper case began in a quiet neighborhood and ended in a farmhouse. Two worlds, wealth and working class, connected by fear, rumor, and timing. And somewhere between those worlds, Donald Larson became the man history would remember not only as a kidnapped suspect, but also as a mass murderer and a man who lost everything. So, the money, the real kidnappers, the answer to the bigger questions all remain unfound. What we're left with is a story split in two, one about mercy and one about rage. The Piper kidnappers treated their victim with care. They offered her food, conversations, cigarettes, and even clothing to keep her warm. They were calm, deliberate, and almost gentle with her. Donald Larson was not that way with his family and his neighbor. Like I said, 10 days before he was charged in that same kidnapping, he murdered 5 people inside his own farmhouse. So what happened between those two worlds? Did the investigation, the pressure, the suspicion, the endless shadow of guilt change him into something else? Or was it always there, waiting beneath the surface, long before the Piper case ever began? The truth is buried somewhere between those questions. What we do know is that the money is still missing, and the real kidnappers are still unknown. And the story, it's still unfinished. I'm Cole, and this was True Crime Tuesday. Come back next Tuesday when we dig into another story that makes us ask the questions. Did the Piper investigation create a killer or expose one?